Well, good morning. Um, Today we're going to talk about grazing warm season annuals. On Tuesday, Darren Redfern's going to talk more about selecting warm season annuals for hay and silage. And there he's going to get into more of some of the various types of warm season annuals, as well as talk about some of the options you have. For instance, in sorghum Sudan and sorghum, we have some options like photoperiod sensitive, BMR, male sterile, dry stock. And these traits have some potential value depending on the situation that you're in. And so we're going to get more into that next week. But this week, I wanted to focus mostly on grazing. And so I'll just start out again, reminding you, we do have quite a few options in the warm season annual realm. But again, grasses are kind of the key in terms of forage production. And if we're thinking about grazing in particular, my two favorites are really Sudan grass and pearl millet, but Sudan grass is my favorite for in-season grazing. So what I'm really talking about there is I kind of think about when we might graze warm seasons as two different time frames. One would be in season or while they're growing. So if you remember from last week, we talked about planting, really kind of late May, got about 45 days, and then it'll be ready to start grazing. And so, sometime in early to mid-July, it'd be ready. You graze July and August and even into some of September. That's the time frame I talk about when I talk about in season. And I think Sudan grass is undervalued because of its regrowth potential. I think it's a really great option for this time period. The other time period that we have would be really to think about stockpiled forages. So grazing in the fall and into the winter. So a lot of times that might be that you're planting in a little bit later because maybe you had something like wheat that you harvested before, and this is a double crop, or maybe we're doing something where we're doing a cool season for hay, and then we're going to plant this. But I think there are some differences in terms of the best options for planting in season and grazing in season, and grazing stockpiled. And I will say with the stockpiled forage, pearl millet does have some great options there, especially if you're trying to graze in October, maybe before it's completely winter killed, because the millets do not produce prussic acid, and thus you can graze them during the frost period. Also, pearl millet kind of has a waxier outer layer and may hold up a little better during the stockpiling period. But if you're going to allow a lot of biomass to accumulate, there is some advantages to maybe thinking about photoperiod sensitive or male sterile traits. And a lot of times you can get those in sorghum Sudan or in pearl millet to be able to retain a little higher feed value in that stockpiled forage, because they won't be producing seed heads and thus putting a lot of energy into the seed, and so you'll have some higher sugar content. Okay, so there are also options for legumes like mung bean, cowpea, and sun hemp. The truth is that a lot of times we don't get a significant amount of forage out of the legumes when they're planted with our really strong warm season grasses like Sudan grass, sorghum Sudan, pearl millet. But I'll actually talk a little bit about what we've been doing with sun hemp. And then I also want to mention this forb. I want to mention sunflowers because I think for stockpiling, they have some advantages in that they, when they do produce that seed can provide a lot of feed value. Okay, so I'm going to start really talking about in season, and then we'll move into kind of that stockpiled situation. So the first thing I talked about, prussic acid. Prussic acid is basically cyanide. And It is found in the immature plants of sorghum, Sudan grass, and sorghum Sudan grass. Sorghum is the highest risk. It has the highest concentrations, followed by sorghum Sudan, and then Sudan grass is usually the lower risk of those three. And in fact, when we think about Sudan grass, we typically suggest that as long as the plant's greater than 15 inches, it's low risk. For sorghum, we usually say 2 feet, so 24 inches, and sorghum Sudan is probably 18 inches to 24 inches. So that's very immature plants. And that means even with regrowth, you don't want to be grazing it until it reaches those target heights. So you can get this test strip that you can use to test for prussic acid if you're worried about it. For instance, if you think the plant is kind of in a tweener stage, or if you're around the frost period. And I'll send out information on email. There's a really great video on YouTube that shows how to use these strips. It's not a quantitative test, but it is qualitative and will give you some idea of whether you're in a risky situation or not. And we used that this summer, and I thought it worked fairly well. Now I mentioned the small plants, but also when those plants get frosted, there is prussic acid production. The cells release contents and they mix and produce the cyanide. And so you want to get off before the first frost, and you want to wait until 7 days after the killing frost to get back out and utilize the rest of the plant material. And in fact, that's one of the things where, if you're trying to graze kind of in that late September into October time period, that might be one reason to switch to pearl millet or a millet, because millets don't produce the prussic acid. However, I think Sudan grass for in-season grazing has a lot of advantages. So grazing management. The first thing, the key criteria, or the key thing to remember, is that annuals grow fast. All of them do. And it's quite different from perennials. And it's actually somewhat hard to make the transition from grazing perennials to grazing annuals in terms of mindset. One of the things is that you want to get on it early, and you want to have a very high stocking rate, because you kind of want to hit them hard, because you want to keep them in this vegetative state. So lower yielding, but higher quality, because they'll regrow really well if you manage them right. And thus you can maintain very high quality feed value for your animals. And thus we suggest rotationally grazing. I think rotationally grazing with annuals is even more valuable in terms of the performance advantages than you would get, with perennials. You don't get a lot of performance advantage. You get more advantage in terms of the amount of grazing per acre. And I think you get a little bit of both when it comes to annuals. So let's talk a little bit about what that kind of looks like. And so I have on here, Jerry Valesky put this slide together, but I think it's really great in that it kind of gives you an idea of the feeding value and helps you to understand. When I was talking about high quality, early vegetative and late vegetative here, if you look at the crude protein and the TDN, what you see is that we have very good crude protein contents, alfalfa hay esque, if that makes sense. I mean, 15 to 20% crude protein is very good. And then we have on TDN, we're 67 to 72. That's not quite corn silage. It's maybe like drought stress corn silage, but still very, very high energy and better than any hay you would have, even a high quality hay. And so I think it's really important to understand that it can be really good, or you can be down here, like when it produces a seed head and that seed head is mature or maturing, it's in the dough stage, we're down here into 55 to 60 TDN and 6 to 9% crude protein, so fairly low crude protein. And if you do let that seed head get fully mature, you're you're in that 6 crude protein and 50 to 55 TDN, that's, um, not very high. And so depending on the animal you're feeding, of course, you can kind of target, remembering that yield is increasing as maturity increases, but quality is declining. If I'm grazing though, in season, I want it to regrow so I get multiple grazings. And if you have the moisture to do that, and I should point that out, like in eastern Nebraska, we have the moisture to get regrowth. And so targeting regrowth and management for regrowth is really valuable. If you have irrigation, I would say that's true as well. If you're in a drier situation, like in western Nebraska, and you're not irrigated, you may not manage the same. You might actually manage to get a little bit more yield before you start grazing because you're only going to get one grazing. And thus, we're going to change our management, as I mentioned in the last session, to thinking about more like strip grazing, getting higher utilization of what is there and allowing more to accumulate to start, but recognizing that you're not trying to get regrowth. I'm going to assume when we're talking about in season here, we're targeting regrowth. And so if we're targeting regrowth, we want to start grazing at 45 days post-emergence. That's usually when it's ready. It's usually ready about 1.5 to 2 feet tall is kind of what we're targeting as our start height. Now I'll show you that even 45 days post-emergence can be too late depending on the year and the season. But this idea of 1.5 to 2 feet kind of gives you a good idea of this is when I need to be on it, and it grows fast. I can't say that enough. Then I also suggest 3 or more paddocks for a rotation because you want to be able to kind of do a quick rotation. I like 3 to 4 days to get on there, utilize it fairly uniformly, and then get off. The other thing is that with an initial grazing, you want to graze it fairly hard. So with the summer annuals like Sudan grass, we're shooting for like 6 inches stubble. And the reason is that there is data that shows that if you graze it down to 6 inches, you stimulate more tillering. And so you'll get actually more plant biomass out of the subsequent grazing by grazing down a little bit harder on that first initial graze when it is fairly vegetative, at that 1.5 to 2 feet tall. Then after that, you want to actually now start grazing down to only 10 inches because the growth points that you're trying to stimulate are in a different place called the auxiliary buds. But then we're trying to get from the actual tillers we already have, we're trying to get regrowth. So 6 inches for that initial grazing, 10 inches after. And this is the reason why I love Sudan grass. So it's the anchor roots. So this green material is a stem of a Sudan grass. And you can kind of see in the middle here, you can see that kind of purple area. That's actually where the stem got stomped on. And it's actually broken apart. And you're kind of seeing the inside of the plant, and we've got a little bit of death of some of the cells, and we've seen that color change because we're getting some, lovely mold growth and stuff in there. So normally you would expect that all of the plant material above where that stem got broken off to die off, and you can see it looks very healthy above that next node. So that little bump area here. And that's because right here you see these little anchor roots that are coming off. Basically what happens is that plant, when it gets damaged, it sends down roots at the next node and continues to grow. And so Sudan grass is really great at being able to handle trampling. Okay, so I'm going to talk just a little bit about some experiences because I think when you're thinking about what do I do, it's really nice to see what other people have done and what has happened as a result. So last year, we grazed Sudan grass or a mix of Sudan and sun hemp. So we were kind of trying to compare the two. And we were also looking at a comparison of nursing cows. So we were April calving cows, And in July, that's our breeding season, and we have 60 to 90-day-old calves. So we put them out on the Sedan or the Sedan Sun Hip mix. And we also took stockers and put them out. Now our stockers were a little heavy. They were 870 pounds when they went out. And those stockers, just to help you understand what they were actually weaned in the fall. They were put out on stalks during the winter, and then they went out onto rye during the early spring. And so that's why they're kind of at this heavier weight. They gained really well in rye. So we had 0.75 pairs per acre, so cow-calf pairs, or 1.3 stockers per acre. And we had, fairly similar body weights in the end between those two. And we did have a 4-paddock rotation, and we had 8 different groups. So 4 groups of cows, 4 groups of stockers. So we could kind of see, statistically compare what's going on. Okay, so last spring, we did not have moisture. And this is rye that we killed at this time point. We sprayed it right after this picture. And you can see that the soil was quite dry. You can see that crack going through there. Very powdery, and I thought killing this rye and planting something was the dumbest thing I'd ever done, but we tried it. And we got a little bit of rain, like a half an inch of rain between that planting and this picture here, which was basically a week after planting. And you can see we had germination. I still figured that we didn't have a lot of moisture, that we probably would die off, and indeed it did not. It did really well. So we planted on the 31st of May, and by the 7th of July, so basically 37 days later, it was ready to graze. We were not ready to graze. I was not ready to graze. I thought, we had another week. And so you can see it is probably about 18 inches to 2 feet. But I didn't have all my fences up, so we put up fences. And this is what it looked like when we turned out. So we turned out literally a week later. I mean, not even a full week. So this is the 7th, and this is the 12th. So 5 days later, it had grown to 3 to 4 feet tall. Most of the field was 3 feet tall. There were kind of half of the field was a little bit more productive than the other half. So about 4 pastures were better than the other 4. And the 4 pastures that were the most productive were about 4 feet tall. That picture is of Shelby, who is about 5 foot tall here, just for reference. So a week. Huge difference. So remember, they grow fast. And so we were a little bit behind the 8 ball. This is what it looked like after our first grazing. A lot of the material we had grazed down to target, and some of it we had not. So if you see this picture now, we are at 7:15. And this is, so we grazed for 3 days in that one paddock. And then this is what it looked like 3 days later. So that's how much regrowth we got in 3 days. So again, they grow very fast and recover really well. This is what the last paddock in the rotation looks like. So this is the day we turned into that last paddock. It was 5 foot tall. This was the stocker calf, and this was a cow from cow-calf pair. So you can see it is quite tall. And it got away a little bit. So probably it's not ideal. And I'll say it's definitely not ideal because we got about 20% less grazing days off of this paddock throughout the summer than we did from the other paddocks. And it's because I think it did not tiller as well. So we did not get as good a regrowth. In fact, we had to skip some of these paddocks, especially in the higher performing field. Part of the field, those paddocks were further along in their maturity when we got on them, and so they didn't recover as well as the ones where the field wasn't doing quite as well, and so it wasn't quite as tall. So again, getting on it early is important. This is what the first paddock looked like in terms of its tillering. So what you see here is that this is basically 10 days since we were on, since we started grazing. And you can see we have a lot of really nice tillers now in this plant base. And we've got some good coverage here. And 2 days later, we turned out onto those paddocks. And so 10 days from when we had finished grazing, we were, well, 9 days, I guess, from when we finished grazing to when we were back on it in this case. And you can see there's plenty of growth here for us to be grazing. So again, grows quick, right? So we had a nice fast rotation trying to make sure we're keeping these plants vegetative. Now, about a week later, this is what it looked like, in that we were seeing some yellowing of the plants. We did not put nitrogen on this field. Remember, it was really dry. Well, we had put nitrogen on for the rye, and we sampled before we planted the Sudan, and we had about 40 pounds of residual nitrate in the ground. And so I decided not to fertilize, mostly because I actually didn't think this would succeed. And now this is the repercussions of that decision. We were starting to see the growth slow. We had been getting a lot of really good moisture, but I don't know 100% that it wasn't that we just didn't have a lot of sun, because we were getting a lot of rain. But I do think that we were seeing some reduced nitrogen, because the new growth was the parts that were looking yellow. So we traditionally suggest about 80 to 100 pounds total for our warm seasons to get the most growth. And we would suggest a split application. So probably like near planting, and then again about the middle of the season. So about now would have been a good time to put on nitrogen. Unfortunately, it kept raining, and so we couldn't get into the field to get fertilizer on until very late. So I don't think it did us much good. Okay, what about the quality though? So I was telling you that if you keep it vegetative, it will retain high quality. So this is the 30th of July. And I went through and just plucked some samples of what we thought the cattle were eating. And I just wanted to show you. So Sudan grass here, the crude protein content was about 20% crude protein. So alfalfa quality crude protein. And the sun hemp, which remember is a legume, and so it fixes nitrogen, and we would expect that it would be higher in crude protein. It was 25, but 20 is not low by any means. On energy basis, the Sudan was pretty good, 63% TDN, and the sun hemp was also really good, a little bit better at 66. So you keep this in mind, because one of the questions is, does having that sun hemp improve the performance? And of course, remember, I gave the sun hemp the best chance also at improving yield, in that we didn't put on nitrogen. But we didn't see a difference really in the carrying capacity between the monoculture and the mix. We did put a lot more cost into the mix in terms of seed. One of the things that we had noticed early on, though, was that the stockers and the cows were not eating the sun hemp. Everything we'd read said it was palatable, but they weren't eating it. They hadn't been exposed to it before. By a month in, though, the stockers had figured it out, and they were consuming it really in equal proportions to the Sudan grass. So you can't see any sun hemp here above the Sudan after a graze. And you can see this was, grazed really well. It was grazed about 10 inches. This is kind of where we were shooting for. But at the same time period, the cows were not consuming it, and they really didn't figure it out. So you can see, at the flank of this cow, you can see sun hemp popped up. You can see it in the front of this other cow here. It is standing above. They would actively avoid it. I watched a cow who's grazing. She's going along grazing. She would touch the sun hemp, and she would move around it and keep going. So for some reason, they had not figured it out. And I've heard other people since this observation tell me that, yeah, it takes them a little while to figure it out. So doesn't really do us a lot of good in terms of the quality if they don't consume it. So late graze versus early graze. I just wanted to show you a picture because the paddock here that looks a little bit more yellow is a paddock that we grazed late in that rotation. So it's that fourth versus the first paddock in the rotation. And the thing I really wanted you to see is the difference in the amount of tillers and cover that we have in the early graze versus the late graze. The late graze, you see a lot more just stem, like individual stems. And so I really do think that's why we were getting less grazing. The way we managed was we just moved in the rotation based off of which paddock looked like it had the most growth and was ready for grazing. And so we did end up skipping some of the late graze paddocks a few times before we caught on. It did seem to catch up towards the end. And so we ended up having only about 20% loss in the really well-doing parts of pastures, if that makes sense. Okay, so kind of an overview. We grazed for 57 days. We ended up pulling off on the 7th of September because we started running out of forage. It was still actively growing, and we probably could have went longer if I had put on nitrogen earlier. We did not get nitrogen on until like the 25th of August. So we didn't really give it enough time to do anything, just to be honest. And that was mostly a moisture challenge that we couldn't get into the field. We did 3 to 4 day rotation, so 3 to 4 days per paddock and a 4 paddock rotation. We, on average, had 10 days rest between grazings, and that's pretty amazing that it can keep up with that. So every paddock got grazed 3 to 4 times. This was a stocking rate we used. Early on, we actually stocked a little bit heavier, and then we pulled off a little bit later. And that was mostly because, remember, it kind of got away from us. So I think this is actually a fairly good stocking rate. If I got on at the right time, I think we would have just went a little bit later. Overall, we got 3 AUMs per acre, which is pretty good. So I was pretty happy with that. I should point out, with these pairs, we also had bulls out there. Peak lactation cows maintained their body condition. So they went on at about a 5.5. They came off at about a 5.5. Their nursing calves, who were 60 to 90 days old going out, did gain 2 pounds during that period. And the heavy stockers gained about 2.1 pounds per day. So pretty good stuff. This is the actual performance. And I just wanted to show you on the stockers, there was one thing that we observed, and that is about 1/10 of a pound a day increase in gain in the mix. We didn't see that's the only thing that we really saw on the mix versus the monoculture. No difference in the amount of forage or anything like that. It'd be interesting. We're doing this again this year to see if this holds out and holds true or not. Okay, so now let's talk about dormant season grazing. And I just wanted to use this one as an example. It was a 17-way mix that a producer planted in mid-July after harvesting oats. And so no fertilizer was put on this field. It wasn't eastern Nebraska. It only yielded about 1 ton of biomass per acre. Most of that biomass was grasses, and it was in particular pearl millet, German millet, and brown top millet. That was basically 70% of what was out there. The Forbes, I should point out, I say 70%. Actually, it would have been more like 85% if you include the grass seed heads. And I actually separated them out. So if you look at this, you can see the seed head right here. It's all full of mature seeds. So the German millet and the brown top millet had mature seeds by the time it got winter killed. And that was almost 13% of the mix. And I just wanted to point out here that the grasses themselves were actually fairly low quality, low crude protein, low energy. But the heads actually were higher in protein, almost 10% crude protein, 65% TDN. So that was beneficial. Yes, the legumes, which they put a lot of legumes in, got very, very little biomass out of them. They were higher quality, what was there. It was mostly actually the cool seasons, like the vetch that was present. But higher quality, a lot of money going into those. And then the Forbes was mostly, to be honest, sunflowers. There was some buckwheat and turnip that was out there, and rapeseed, so the brassicas, but the sunflower made up the majority. And I did pull off the heads and separate them because I think that has a lot of feed value, and I wanted to know what was there. And so what you see is on the Forbes here, that would be sunflower stems, buckwheat, and a little bit of turnip and radish, or excuse me, not radish, but rapeseed. And it was 10% of the mix in terms of biomass, and it's fairly low quality. And that's because the buckwheat was very low quality at this point. And of course, sunflower stems were very low quality. But the sunflower head itself, high quality, 11% crude protein, 64% energy, TDN. So between the seed heads and the sunflower heads, we have some good feed value out there. It's just not a high proportion of the mix. So we did allow them to be selective. We put out growing calves, and so I wanted to get decent performance. Also, one of the goals was to have good cover on the ground. And so you can see this is basically when they were done grazing a strip, what it looked like. So great cover, not really any bare ground. The way we did this, though, is we were wanting to compare continuous grazing to strip grazing because, you have a lot of biomass. How do you get the most use out of it while maintaining good ground cover? So we had fields that we grazed continuously, and we ended grazing when we got to the same amount of residual as we were getting with the strip grazing. And we ended the strip grazing when we ended the continuous to look at the performance of the animals over the same time period, if that makes sense. So I will show you the calves figured out very quickly. They liked the sunflower heads. So on the strip graze, every time we would move the strip, the first thing they do is go and collect all the sunflower heads. This is what they look like, just to show you they're not full. But they did have quite a bit of seed in there, and it was about 7% fat. So it's a nice little energy supplement. And then they also selected those grass seed heads. And, you can see it's in the manure here. I did open up some of these little seeds, and there was starch in there. So they're not really getting full use out of it, but they were selecting it, so they're probably getting something. Okay, so how long did we graze? We got 54 days of grazing. Ended up having the continuous grazing at 1 calf an acre for those 54 days, or 1 acre per calf. And then on the strip grazing, we ended up using about a quarter of the acre, or a quarter less of the acres. So as you can imagine, right, we could have grazed longer with the strip grazing. We pulled them off because we wanted to look at the gain during that time period. And so looking at the gain, we didn't come up with a statistical difference in gain. It's 1/10 of a pound less numerically in the strip, which you might expect if you were reducing some selectivity. But remember, we were trying not to have differences in selectivity, in that we were trying to have the same amount of residual at the end. One of the things you will see is that disappearance here numerically is decreased with the strip, meaning we probably had less trampling losses. And that's why we ended up with more AUMs per acre on the strip, about a 43% increase in the AUMs. So basically, if you think about it as the carrying capacity, the number of 1,000-pound animals you could graze for a month is increased on the strip and a fairly substantial amount. And gain per acre was increased because we had more AUMs. And so even though numerically the average daily gain was lower, so individual animal performance might be just a tinge lower. Because of the increased carrying capacity, we got more gain per acre, which basically means, like, if you think about distributing your cost, right? You're distributing your cost over more pounds of gain. Now, is it worth it? Well, everybody's situation is different, and so you'd have to kind of figure out what your labor costs are. In this case, if we look at our costs per acre, you know, our seed cost was fairly high. It's $50 per acre here because it was that diverse mix. And then on the strip graze, I charged extra labor here. So I had 10 animals per group. It took us 30 minutes to move the fence. I charged that. So it is probably inflated, because if I had bigger groups, it would be less per individual animal, if that makes sense. But on average here, we came out with about $5 less per AUM, because remember, even though there's more labor and thus more costs associated, we got more grazing. So you probably need to come up with your own numbers, but I will say, you know, especially the more expensive forages, the more value there is to being able to have better harvest efficiency. Okay, so with that, I'll just say thank you for tuning in, and we will be having our next session on Tuesday. And again, that's Darren Redfern, and he's going to talk about warm season annuals for hay and silage. So I'll put in the notes below